Hello and welcome to the Socialist World podcast from the Committee for Workers International, putting forward a Marxist analysis and revolutionary socialist program to arm the struggle against capitalism.
Hello and welcome to this podcast organised by the Committee for Workers International, a socialist international organisation. And today in our podcast, we're going to be looking at the situation which has developed in Nigeria, the country with the biggest population in Africa. And in recent period, there's been a tremendous amount of turmoil in Nigeria. And one of the sharpest representations of this has been a demonstration which took place towards the end of January this year in Lagos, the commercial capital and the biggest city of Nigeria, a demonstration by residents from all different parts of that city against a government-backed program of demolition of people's homes, enterprises, schools, health centres, churches, mosques, etc., as part of a plan to move the poorer elements of the city away from areas which are scheduled for redevelopment as part of an attempt, if you like, to rebuild the city, not in the interests of the population, but in the interests of the rich elite which dominate Nigeria at the present time. And the demonstration which took place on the 28th of January this year was outside the Parliament building of the Lagos State Assembly, where the protesters were attempting to explain their case and to demand an end to this latest program of demolitions of their homes, of their communities. And in that protest, we saw the brutality of the Nigerian state, where the Nigerian police force attacked the demonstrators, both with tear gas and physically, something which they denied doing, but which was seen on live television by broadcast by reporters who were at the protest itself. And at this protest, not only were the demonstrators attacked, some of them were injured quite severely, but at the same time, we also saw the arrest of two of the activists in the protest, in the movement against the demolitions. And today we're joined by one of those activists who was attacked and then arrested by the police. And that is Comrade Taiwo Hassan Soweto, a well-known activist in Nigeria who's been involved in different movements over the past period. Most recently, he's been the convener of the End Bad Governance movement based in Lagos, where they've been protesting not just on individual issues like the question of demolition, but also against the whole strategy of the Nigerian government, which is based on a quite nakedly neoliberal policy of cutting the living standards of the population in an attempt to try and boost the economy. It sounds contradictory, and it is contradictory. But the result of this policy is one which has enormously deepened the poverty and worsened the situation of the majority of Nigerians. So we welcome Taiwo Hassan Soweto to this podcast and ask him to explain some of the background to the recent events which have taken place, and also what they're planning to do next.
Yes, thank you very much. And I must say that it's my pleasure to be on this podcast, especially because it's an opportunity to explain to the entire global working class, what is happening here in Nigeria in terms of all of the crises of capitalism and how the resistance is building up. And I must thank Comrade Bob for giving a very comprehensive background already to the discussion. Just to add that I'm not just an activist, I'm equally a member of the Democratic Socialist Movement, which is the Nigerian affiliate of the Committee for Workers International. And indeed, this struggle that we're about to discuss now, in many ways, showcases the important work that the CWI has been doing in Nigeria over the decades, but even most crucially in the past few years. Because Nigeria is at the point, or has been at the point over the past 3 years, for instance, where we have had the acute crisis of capitalism manifesting in very, very terrible social and economic and political crisis. And at that very same time, you have a sharp retreat, in the leadership of the labor movement and the ability to provide leadership for struggle. So in that sense, over the past 3 years, members of the Democratic Socialist Movement, that is the Nigerian affiliate of the CWI, we have found ourselves playing, what we usually call a dual role, which is both building the organization and the argument for a socialist alternative, while also having to provide leadership for the resistance of different layers of the working class, the youth, and the poor. And the protest of January 28, 2026 is one of the most dramatic manifestation of the role that we are playing, because it does show how we are not just building a revolution organization, but even right now, we find ourselves at the forefront of the most important battles that the poor and working class have to wage right now. And we also find ourselves bearing the entire consequences of all of these struggles. January 28th was a protest which was called by a coalition which the Nigerian affiliate of the CWI helped to build up to mobilize marginalized communities in Lagos State against the gentrification agenda of the ruling capitalist party and government across Lagos State. And over the past few years, there are visible signs of attempt by, the capitalist elite in cahoots with the ruling APC government to claw back at all of the, all of the progress, all of the achievements in terms of social provision that the working class had won in the city over the past decade. But not just that, but also to dispossess the working class and the poor of lands, of their homes. And this does not just manifest in terms of the physical grabbing of lands. It also manifests, in a galloping increase, in the rate of rent in the city. Something which means that for ordinary working class people, they are not able to, find accommodation, decent one within the city center. And they have to continue to move to the edges of the city to find just any shelter that they can afford. And this has been further compounded, by direct attack on working class communities where the working class historically have found accommodation. And it's important to draw attention, for instance, to 1983, which was a period when, in Lagos State, we had the government of Alhaji Jakonde, a capitalist government, but because of the situation in the world economy at that period, as well as the position of capitalism on the continent, the Jakonde government carried out some, very important progressive social reforms, including massive investment in housing. Those are the, policies that are under attack right now in Lagos State on the basis of gentrification, so that, many working class communities who had lands awarded to them in 1979 to 1980, are finding those lands being taken away from them. Traders, trading groups, who also have lands allocated to them in this period are having all of these lands being taken away. And the way they are being taken away is by, the so-called landlords, who are often members of the ruling party, making a claim on those lands, even when, according to the laws of Nigeria, the state, has, complete authority over the allocation of land. So it's actually a process of primitive accumulation, a scramble by the capitalist ruling elite in Lagos State going on to get their hands on every possible scrap of land that they could get their hands on. And in that way, dispossessing the poor in Lagos State. And this got to a head, for instance, late last year, when the Lagos State government went after the fishing community of Makoko, which is just, situated around or underneath the most, one of the very iconic, popular infrastructure in Lagos State called the Third Mainland Bridge. Makoko is a community that's been there since the 20th century, if not earlier. This is a place where people have lived in for more than a century. And the Lagos State government went after this community on December 23rd last year with bulldozers, going into the community to begin to bulldoze people's homes, and without any notification whatsoever. And in carrying out this demolition, the police, alongside with thugs, unleashed violence on the community, something which led to the death of about 12 members of the community, including a 5-day-old baby. So this was the condition of things, by the time, January came, and we all saw the massive destruction going on. And on the basis of this reality, the Democratic Socialist Movement, the Nigerian affiliate of the CWI, swung into action right from the very first week of January. And they entered into discussion with civil society organizations, NGOs, and other organizations that have been campaigning around issues of right to shelter and all of that in Lagos State. And on the basis of this discussion that we initiated, a new coalition was born called the Coalition Against Demolition, Forced Eviction, and the Land Grabbing in Lagos State. It was this coalition, that led the massive protest of January 28th. And that protest was not just about Makoko, it was not just about a single community. But what the coalition did was to unite all communities that were facing this crisis. So we had about 5 communities who mobilized their residents out to the protest. So that people at the protest were numbering between 3,000 to 5,000. It was a massive protest, something that has not been seen in recent times in the state. And I think that was what frightened the Lagos State government, because it became very clear for them that with that kind of massive mobilization, the possibility of another, revolt on the scale of EndSARS some 6 years ago was being posed. And that also, informed the kind of very, very vicious response that the Lagos State government had to unleash on the protest on that day. Right from the very moment when this protest started, it was obvious that it was the Lagos State government and the police did not want the protest to take place. The Commissioner of Police, alongside with other officers of the police force, did everything to frustrate the protest at every turn. And that the protest even got up to the parliament, was on the basis of the creativity, and the patience and the resilience of the organizers of the protest, including, the members of the Democratic Socialist Movement. But by the time we got to the parliament building, we met what you would call like a war party, welcoming us. Several armored tanks stationed in front of the parliament building, and a wall of armed policemen led by the Commissioner of Police himself, stood at the gate of the assembly. And, from their demeanor and from interactions with them, the message they had for protesters was that you cannot go beyond this point. And that was where and how things began to unravel very, very rapidly. The Commissioner of Police has gone to the press over the past 2 weeks to try and give the impression that protesters provoked the police and all of that, or blocked the highway. None of this happened whatsoever. The protest was one of the best organized protests that we've had in recent times, in Lagos State. Well organized, very peaceful. There was no incident at all of protesters, throwing stones or provoking the police, in any way. In fact, and this is a very good example. One of the last speech I made at the protest before I was arrested was me telling protesters to calm down. We had already made our, positions known to the members of the House of Assembly and the police, and they are going to discuss among themselves and get back to us. So protesters should calm down. Everybody should sit down. And then I also told protesters that we're going to start circulating pure water and gala, which is like, what would you call it? Just something for people to eat while they were at the protest. That was my last announcement before the police shot tear gas. That video has surfaced now, which shows the last speech I made, clearly telling protesters to sit on the floor and that there was no need, there was no cause for alarm. So that in that sense, this was a completely armless protest, a protest that was that posed no threat at all, either to the parliament building or to the parliamentarians or to public safety. So that the attack by the police was premeditated. It was an attack meant to teach the people a lesson, to show that you cannot oppose the grand plan of the Lagos State and ruling elite to change the poor out of Lagos without consequence. So that when they unleashed the violence, they wanted to pass that message. And in the process of, attacking the protesters and shooting tear gas, many protesters, were wounded. Many more than have been accounted for publicly actually were wounded. But at least 2 protesters were hospitalized, and each of them, were hit directly by tear gas canisters on their legs. One of them, a woman, returned back to the hospital this afternoon after spending 7 days, in the hospital. She was discharged last weekend and then returned today to have a wound cleaned. And the doctors are talking about a further surgery in order to cover the wound, which is still gaping. There's still a gaping hole on her leg where the tear gas canister actually, hit her. That was how vicious, the violence for the police was. But the violence wasn't just targeted at the protesters. The violence was also in many ways premeditated and targeted against myself. And that's because of the role that the CWI Nigeria has been playing, especially since August 2024, when the End Bad Governance protest erupted. And because of the role we are playing, providing leadership, for the resistance of the working class and the poor in Lagos State, even while still calling on the trade unions, to provide leadership for struggle. That, in many ways, has really made the Lagos State government and the ruling party to become very, very uncomfortable with the CWI in Lagos State. So that the police attack on January 28th was also meant, to actually capture me because of the role I had been playing. And when I was arrested, the first thing the police did was to drag me behind the security post right there in the parliament building. And about 7 policemen descended on me and they started beating me so viciously with kicks, with battings, with punches. And what was most, shocking was that the commissioner of police, who's like the most superior police officer in the city, was actually involved in the entire brutalization. He wasn't supervising it, like maybe he was just looking from somewhere and seeing his men doing that. He was eating me alongside with his men. And each time he hit me, he would scream into my ear, "You called me a killer." And that's because during the protest, I, alongside many organizers of the protests, constantly, spoke to the media, and exposed what the police had done in the different communities, where demolition had taken place. How they had gone into these communities, shooting tear gas and live bullets, something which also had led to the death of at least 53 people in at least 3 communities. In Makoko itself, between December 23rd and the first week of January, 12 residents of the community died because of asphyxiation from tear gas fumes shot by the police into the community. This included a 12-day-old baby. In another community like Oroshoki, 35 people were killed by the police in November last year in order to carry out demolition. And in Owode Oniri, another community, 6 men were actually murdered by the police sometimes last year. So, because we were talking about this constantly, that was why the Commissioner of Police actually felt that he needed to capture me and deal seriously with me. So each time he hit me or kicked me, that was what he was screaming to my ears. And at a point when he realized that I could see him while he was beating me, because he asked me to lie down with my face down on the ground. But each time they kicked me, I was turning and I could see who was doing what. The commissioner of police became very uncomfortable and then asked his men to blindfold me. And what they did immediately was that they tore my shirt and used my shirt to blindfold me to the back. And then my two arms, they used handcuffs to restrain it to the back. What this meant was that I couldn't now turn or block any blow coming to me. So they laid me back on the floor and another round of beating started. The beating was so vicious, so terrible, because these were like grown men, hefty men, about 7, hitting me at different points. There was a time when a blow landed on the back of my head and I just passed out. And it was another blow to my side, which woke me up. So in that sense, it looked like they actually wanted to get rid of. But eventually, they stopped beating me and then they dragged from the assembly, from the parliament building, down to a waiting van, and then they took me to the police station. And of course, at the police station, another drama, started, which was about, wanting the policemen wanting me to write a statement, which is customary, obviously, when you're at the police station. But the law of Nigeria is also quite clear that you can only do that, in the presence of your lawyer. They did not allow me to have access to my phone, either to call my lawyer or to call even, a family member. Of course, because of this, I refused to write a statement. This went on for about an hour. And then they decided, therefore, that even if I didn't write a statement, they could still charge me to court regardless. But they had a problem. And that problem was that by the time I got to the police station, I was covered in bruises and I was bleeding from my head, from my lip, from my face, just everywhere I was bleeding. And I think that for the police, they felt that taking me to court and charging me while bleeding was going to be too embarrassing for the police. So they called in a nurse to treat my wound. I refused to be treated. And I told the nurse that if she went ahead to treat me against my consent, she was going to be partaking in torture, which is clearly a crime. Of course, the policemen became angry. And then they asked that my hand be restrained again with handcuffs. And they asked 2 policemen, 2 of their colleagues, to pin me down so that the nurse could forcibly treat me and give me injection. But because I kept on resisting, and the nurse herself apparently had a little bit of conscience, she then told the police that she could not go on with treating a man without, his consent. And that was how, the nurse left. So, because they had been defeated now, they couldn't treat me. I couldn't write a statement. They then decided that I should be taken to court, like that, still bleeding. But unfortunately for them, at the time they took the decision that I should be taken to court, the time had gone so considerably. So that by the time we got to court, the court itself has closed. We met an empty court. There was no lawyer in court, no magistrate. And then the policemen started calling the magistrate, urging him to come back to court. This was around 5:30 in the evening. Because what they wanted to do was that before comrades would know where I'd been taken to, before any lawyer would be, available to defend me, they wanted to just quickly arraign me so that a magistrate could just commit me to jail and I would be there for several weeks or several months. But they were unlucky. They met an empty courtroom. And every of their effort to call the magistrate to come back failed. And that was how I was taken back alongside with, the second protester back to the police station. They slept overnight in a very dingy cell. And then the next morning we were driven back to court again. But at this time, of course, comrades had gotten wind of where we were. So that by the time we got to the court, we met comrades, lawyers, already waiting for us. And that was how whatever plan the Commissioner of Police and Lagos State government had to put me in jail for as long as possible, that was how it was defeated. So that eventually we got a bail, at the court on that day. We were charged on 5 count charge, all bordering on breach of public peace. There was one of the charges that says that, we committed a crime of singing abusive song against the police and the Lagos state government. I mean, obviously, there's nothing in Nigeria's law that talks about abusive song, but this is just an attempt by the police to try and present to the court, something that looks like real charges. But these are charges that would not stand the test of scrutiny by the time the trial starts. So that was how we then got bail on that day, and we were released. The next court sitting now will be the 11th. The next court sitting now will be the 11th of March 2026. But then, since we have been released, we have been, trying to expose the crime that Lagos State government and the police have committed during the period of our arrest and the period that we're in custody, so that moving forward, it's not just going to be one trial that we're going to have. At the level of the movement, there's also a plan to sue the Lagos State Police Commissioner, for what he did in terms of the violent dispersal of the protest, as well as the attack and assault on myself and all other protesters. But what is also very interesting is that despite what I have suffered and other protesters have suffered on January 28th, the Lagos State government realized in the aftermath of the January 28th protest that they could no more go on with the policy of gentrification that they had, especially for Makoko, due to the backlash that they received, from the way that protest was handled. So right now, the Lagos State government has been on a retreat over the demolition of Makoko. They have immediately announced that the demolition should be halted, and they have held at least 3 meetings with the communities with a view to begin to discuss, and negotiate compensation for the community. But the interesting thing is that even in this retreat, the completely vicious character of the gentrification policy has even become even much more exposed. And that for me really is an important, exposure that demonstrates very, very clearly the completely vicious aspect, of the struggle of this policy of gentrification that we are opposing and mobilizing against. In retreating, the Lagos State government has come out with the idea that they are no more going to displace the people in Makoko, but rather they are going to develop Makoko into what they call a water city. But the interesting thing is that the idea of a water city project for Makoko had been in the pipeline for at least 5 years. Indeed, it was a project that the Lagos State government was meant to implement in partnership with the United Nations. The United Nations was supposed to provide some millions of dollars to the Lagos State government to do that. But somehow, the Lagos State government last year turned their back on that partnership and concessioned the land of Makoko, the land and the waterway that Makoko currently occupies, to a real estate company called FBT Kora, which paid huge millions of naira to Lagos State government. And the idea was to wipe out the entire, community, so that this real estate company can build an estate in Makoko with high-rise buildings and all of that, expensive and luxurious homes that no current resident of Makoko would be able to afford. But then the question is that the Lagos State government, the argument for the entire demolition ab initio was that it was because they wanted to save the community, because some members of the community, according to them, built under pipelines, so that the demolition was meant for public safety. The demolition was meant, also to take care of the environmental implication of a communities, building houses on the waterways. So these were some of the arguments that the Lagos State government, were putting forward, before now. But in the real sense of the word, the new revelations that we are seeing now, with the Lagos State government now on retreat, is actually showing that the Lagos State government had an alternative to developing Makoko, which would not have led to displacement of anybody, but they chose, however, to choose a plan that will lead to displacement. And I think that this, graphically explains the character of the capitalist elite, not just in Lagos State, but also in Nigeria, especially at this period of the intensification of crisis for capitalism in the country. Because one of the very important contexts to what we have seen happening in Lagos State, especially the scramble for land, is the fact that despite that Nigeria's economy is said to have emerged from the post-COVID, recession, yet that recovery has not led to, any real expansion, for instance, in manufacturing and industry. Rather, where you have had the most important growth in the area of the economy is most likely is especially in the area of extraction and also in the service sector. But in terms of industrial and manufacturing, which is the backbone of the economy, or meant to be the backbone of the economy, we continue to have low growth in these areas. So what that means, therefore, is that for a majority of the capitalist elite in Nigeria today, there is a relapse back to land speculation as a major means of storing value and also of profit maximization. So right now, all over Lagos State now, you have development springing up, estates with houses and apartments that many people cannot, that thousands of families cannot afford. Just a few years ago, you had an immense, development take place in Lagos State called the Eco Atlantic City, where possibly the least apartment cost, several thousands of dollars to rent. And since the past 2 years that the Eco Atlantic City has been built up, it still remains, it still remains not fully, not fully rented or fully bought, because the reality is that these are developments taking place in a society where 80% of the population still struggle for the basic means of existence. Only a tiny layer of the population have the resources to be able to pay the kind of money that these real estate developers are demanding for, either for rentage or for the purchase of the houses and apartments that they are building. So in that sense, you have a situation whereby one of the most serious or severe manifestation of the inequality in Lagos State today now is in the housing sector. You have a situation whereby vast majority of the population are constantly losing their homes because rent is going up rapidly, while wages are going down. And people, the only solution that people have is to continue to move away from the city center to the hinterland, to the edges. But even that is no more assured now, because of the basis of the domination of the housing sector, the real estate sector, by private operators. It means that once prices rises anywhere, it also affects prices everywhere. So actually, what you have in Lagos is a war against the poor. And the protest that we had on January 28th is a representation of the kind of resistance that is beginning to start on all of these issues. And what we are concentrating upon now, given the concession that we have just won in Makoko, is how to expand this struggle even beyond the current communities that are currently, mobilized, to also include, tenants, so that, you can have an expanded movement that can begin to fight not just for access to land, not just for access to homes, but actually for the right of any working class person in Lagos State to be able to live in Lagos State. But that is actually what is at stake at the moment.
I'd like to thank Soweto for that very full description of both what happened at the demonstration, but also the crisis which has actually developed in Nigeria. And obviously, if we look internationally, we see in many parts of the world the same processes of housing becoming an extremely important issue because it's entered into a crisis with the enormous development of speculation in housing, where generally now housing is not being built from the point of view of need, where it's seen as a source of speculation, a source of getting money very quickly. And that's what we're seeing in country after country. And as Soweto said, if we look at the situation in Lagos, he described people having to move to the edges of the city. But those people who know Lagos know it's an extremely big city. It's not clear exactly what the population is. It could be 22, 23 million. The public transport system barely exists in Nigeria, and therefore moving to the edge of the city makes it extremely difficult for people to undergo, if you like, to travel to whether it be the place of work, the place of study, healthcare, or whatever. And it's a part of this enormous strain which the society, which, if you like, society is now facing because of what has happened recently under capitalism. But I also think there's another factor as well, which I'd like Soweto to comment on, because I think that what has happened, the brutality of the demonstration, was partly maybe caused by the personal anger of some of the leaders of the police. But also I think it, as Soweto mentioned, it represents a certain fear, both not just in the police, but in the ruling elite. Because on the one hand, as Soweto said, in the recent years, there have been very limited protests in Nigeria in response to the crisis which the country is facing. But the ruling class, the ruling elite, they fear the Nigerian population. That's the real question. It's a long time ago now, but in 2012, we saw a big spontaneous movement of the big sections of the population in Nigeria against an increase in the fuel price. It was a movement which developed very rapidly from below. It became a general strike. But if you like it, the movement came from below. It wasn't the result of leaders actually leading that movement. Now, in the end, that movement petered out. It won a few concessions, but it didn't fundamentally change the system. And what we have seen in Nigeria is that every time movements start to develop, the ruling elite are terrified that they could develop into a new 2012. So that meant that when there was the End SARS movement against police brutality, that was, if you like, fairly quickly suppressed with some brutality, especially in Lagos. When more recently there was the End Governance protests, End Bad Governance protests in Nigeria, the regime was frightened that that would also develop a momentum and could lead to a spontaneous movement. So those protests were quite rapidly suppressed, and then some of the leaders of the protests were put on trial for treason. It was only towards the end of last year that the state abandoned the attempt to prosecute some of the End Bad Governance leaders for treason. And it shows, in the one sense, the fear of the ruling class is a real fear, and they're right to be scared. They're right to be scared of how the anger could develop into a movement against them. But the question is that where you've got, unfortunately, the trade union leaders, while they make sometimes radical statements, are not prepared for a consistent struggle. They haven't been for many, many years now, where there are no major political parties which are actually offering any real alternative. The major parties which exist mainly fight amongst themselves for who gets the opportunity, to put it bluntly, to loot the country. Because in Nigeria, if you win an election, if you get into an office, then there's an opportunity to loot. That's why Nigerian election campaigns are called do or die campaigns, They're not fighting over ideology or policy. They're fighting for a chance to get their hand on the loot, to be able to steal from the country, because so much of the government's income comes from the export of oil. They therefore feel if they're in positions in the government, they can then get their chance to steal. And that's why, for many of the politicians, so called, who run in elections, they spend large amounts of money to fix the election, to bribe voters, to try to get into power because they see the money as an investment because they can steal even more. And they're quite brutal that they want to maintain that power. So in this situation, it is significant what Soweto said about the concessions which the Lagos government have offered. And even their mixed concessions, because I believe that they've offered some financial concessions. But people don't just want some money, they want to have their homes back. Because if they don't get their homes back, the money which they've been given will very soon disappear as they pay rent. So it's no solution for them. These people have lost their homes, very often homes that they themselves have built, you know. And this is the situation where, if you like, the concession is significant because the police went too far, because part of the attack on the demonstration was filmed, as I said before, live. There have been big reports in the Nigerian media about what happened to Soweto and the other demonstrators who were injured. It's not been hidden, if you like. It's been reported. It's known. So the Lagos state government has retreated a bit, but only for a time. And therefore, I'd like, if Soweto could sort of indicate how he sees the next situation developing in Nigeria, particularly because elections are due in Nigeria early next year. That's elections both for the president, for the national parliament, and for most of the state governors and most of the state parliaments in Nigeria. So we're entering into a quite unstable period when the country is also facing, mainly not so much in Lagos at the present time, but is facing insecurity with the different armed conflicts which are developing in the country, where now we see where Trump has intervened and is threatening to intervene more into these conflicts because they're not confident that the Nigerian state at the present time can deal with some of these conflicts. So it's a very unstable situation, but at the same time, I think that the question is what alternative can be offered, how to, if you like, begin to build a movement which could actually open the way to changing the situation. And that's not going to come overnight, but it's a question of how do you start to build that when there is such anger in society and it's not been reflected anywhere.
Yes, thank you very much. I think when it comes to what happens in 2027, which is next year when Nigeria will be holding a general election, it's really difficult to answer that question in any concrete way, and that's because from the point of view of the working class and the poor, 2027 does not appear like 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 something they can beat their chest that it can open a way out for change, and that's because unlike previous, even the last election where you had the Labour Party, even despite with its internal crisis and with its presidential candidate who is a member of the capitalist elite. Yeah, I mean, a section of the working class and the poor will still look towards the Labour Party as as something they could pitch their hope on. Despite all of the limitations of both the party and its presidential candidate. But with regard to the coming election, and based on what has happened over the past 3 years, it's a different feeling and mood that exists within the working class and the poor right now. There's a sense at which, for vast majority of the population, the impact of the neoliberal economic attacks of the past 3 years is still so it's still being massively felt. People are still really under the effect of all of that. And so that the question of even playing any role in the coming period in terms of election is not posed for many. And then for those who are politically active, the advanced layers, the fact that Labour Party does not exist anymore in the same sense as it existed in the last election is a key issue. That means that even a wider layer now that was active in the last election are likely not going to be active in the coming period. And that's because the bourgeois candidate who ran on the platform of the party in the last election has now gone over to another party. The party has now come under the leadership of a new layer, which is close to the trade unions. But the trade unions themselves have since left the party before this new development. Whether they are going to go back now since the last court ruling, which gave the leadership back to the Nenadi Usman faction of the party, is not something that is clear at the moment. But even if they do, the party, in terms of its public messaging, appears to be going in the direction that would mean that the party would not in any way represent any alternative for the vast majority of the people who are looking forward to a rally point for the next election. I mean, for instance, you have had the governor, of the only governor that the party got elected in the last election, saying that the party is welcome to Tinubu, that is the current president. That is a sign that even though the Labour Party, despite the limitations in the last election, could still be seen by a layer of young people and the working class as an alternative in the coming election, that is not likely to be the case. So in that sense, the general elections coming, if it ever holds, because that's also another important point to make, will likely be seen by vast majority of the people as not something that could provide a means for a change for them, and that's why our strategy as socialists in Nigeria it has to be not just about has to be dual in terms of seeing what campaign we can do around the election, but most importantly, how do we build the forces that can start fighting, start resisting, start spreading socialist idea, the very next day after the general elections. And to do that, we are currently, we are currently talking about how to start discussion with the African National Congress, which is AAC, a radical party, a radical populist party that has as a presidential candidate the activist and journalist Omoyele Sowore, who has contested twice since 2019 and has managed to draw to himself a layer of radical element in society, especially young people who are looking for a fight back. We want to have discussion with that political formation with a view to seeing what kind of electoral alternative that socialists working with that party can put up in the next general election. But the aim of that intervention, obviously, will be to try and oppose directly to the mass of the population the kind of program that is required to save Nigeria against the capitalist programs, the liberal programs that the majority capitalist parties will be putting up in that election, and see how that can be utilized to build a resistance, and an opposition, a political opposition immediately after the election to begin to fight, at the barricades against the policies that whatever government that wins in that election would implement. However, and it's important to say this, that it is also not entirely impossible that a 2007 elections may not happen. And that is in part because of the intensity of the crisis of capitalism that is manifesting in the country at the moment. And it's not just economic, it's also political. And it's also in terms of the insecurity plaguing the country. Right now, far more geographical area of Nigeria is insecure than what was the case in 2019, when in 2015 rather, when the previous PDP government at that time, represented by Jonathan, had to postpone Nigeria's election for about 6 months, for them to be able to deal with Boko Haram insurgency. At that time, the insurgency was restricted to the northeast, especially, the large state of Borno, where Boko Haram had managed to seize some local government, and some rural areas. And because of that, the election was had to be postponed. But in the current situation in Nigeria today, and that is also why, the US is interested in intervening, because Nigeria represents a giant in the continent that, imperialism, no matter, the politics of nationalism, and code that is playing out in the world today, Nigeria represents a behemoth that imperialism cannot allow to fail, given the repercussion that it will mean, not just for the entire continent of Africa in terms of the dislocation, social and economic dislocation that would happen, but also in terms of the influx of refugee population that would begin to mass up on the shores and the borders of Europe and US if such a country fails. Right now, there's no agreement about what Nigeria's population is, but right now the general consensus, depending on which data you are looking at, is that there are at least 230 million people in Nigeria at present. And that population is expected to increase over the next 5 to 10 years to between 250 to between 300 to 500 million. So that means that, the projection for Nigeria is that Nigeria is likely going to be one of the third or fourth most populated countries, in the world in the next quarter of a century or thereabout. This kind of population, spilling out because of a failed state, would have a different consequence for the continent and for global capitalism than has been the case, for instance, with what we have seen in Somalia, Sudan, or these other war-torn countries in Africa. But the possibility of a failed state is starkly posed in Nigeria today on the basis of the rampaging insecurity. Right now, the insecurity has spread so far that the southern part of the country, which is the most stable part, socially and economically, is now being threatened. Boko Haram activities and ISWAP activities have become prominent in Kwara State. Kwara to Lagos State is just a few kilometers. So that in that sense, the possibilities that elections will be postponed, by the regime to say that, and using the excuse of insecurity to continue to stay in power, illegally for the next foreseeable period can be posed, before December. And that's also partly because the regime is also fearful of an election, what an election could mean. Not just because it's afraid of defeat, but because victory now for the ruling party in Nigeria looks like a joke. In the last election, the ruling party, the current government, won with one of the worst votes ever since 1979 in the country, and the election itself recorded one of the lowest ever participation, below 50%. And there's every possibility that even much far less than that number of participants will be recorded in the next general election. So what that means, therefore, is that from the point of view of insecurity, for the point of view of the optics of the regime maintaining dominance, showing that it's popular. An election may not be something that the regime might be looking seriously forward to. The possibility that the regime might want to extend its rule illegally through a postponement of the election using security, is something that we have to be prepared for. And this is something that has been tried anyway among many of Nigeria's neighbors, without any problem. So that is something that could happen. And alongside that is the ever-present possibility, something which has even increased, which is in the current period, of a military coup taking place in Nigeria. And that's because, given the role that Nigeria's army has been playing over the past nearly 2 decades right now, the role that Nigeria's army has been playing right now is a role that it has possibly never played, maybe in the entire period of Nigeria's existence itself. Because this is an army that has become so much funded. The proportion of Nigeria's budget that has gone into defense in the last, 1 decade, I'm not sure it's rivaled at all in the entire history of the country, possibly only in the short period of the Civil War, that Nigeria could say on record that never spent so much in terms of armament, in terms of recruitment, and in terms of votes, for defense and for the army. So in that sense, you have a lot of military generals who also are quite very rich and very much, vested in ensuring that the country does not break open, the country does not break apart suddenly into a crisis or into a war. So that in that sense, the possibility that you could have, the army or a section of it wanting to intervene for the purpose of stability is ever present and could be something that could be realized in the coming period. And that's why the coup scare that we had just recently in the country, just around last year, is not something that should be ignored. Right now, some military officers and civilians are on trial in Nigeria for an alleged coup that they orchestrated and failed sometimes towards the end of last year. Some analysts have said it's just coup-proofing, nothing happened, and all of that. But it's actually an indication, that there's that possibility that a section of the army might want to intervene, and that's particularly because it's from economic, social, and security point of view. The ruling elite, capitalist elite, have demonstrated absolute inability to keep the country together, to maintain stability, to maintain peace, and of course to maintain any modicum of social progress for the vast majority of the population. Nigeria's population right now is divided almost roughly into 70% of being below the age of 30 and only 30% being above the age of 30. So that what that means therefore is at any point in time in the country, you have possibly over 150 million people who are less than 30 years old. And on the basis of the complete cutting of funding to public education, the lack of funding for public health care, the complete near disappearance or collapse of industry and manufacturing, it means that you are having not just low wages, but also an incidence of unemployment, a severe case of unemployment, whereby vast majority of the population are graduating from school, no jobs of any kind. So in that sense, the possibility of a social crisis developing, and of course of revolution also developing, is quite posed. And that's why one of the most important work of CWI in Nigeria today is to see why campaigning for the trade union leadership, to play their role and provide the leadership for the so-called working class. We are also very much interested in seeing how we can, build some sort of mass resistance using our own organization and as well as society organizations that continue to exist in the country. And that really has become very important now, especially because as the situation continues to worsen very, very seriously, the kind of resistance that we are able to put forward appears to be the only thing that is giving any hope at all, for the vast majority of people that things can change through the method of mass struggle. And this kind of hope, even though it's still like a candle light in the wind, can be what can at some point provide illumination for the mass of the people who are trying to find a way out of the hellhole that the country itself has become for almost everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Soweto, both for your introduction about the protests against demolitions in Lagos, but also to give a broad picture of what is the situation today in Nigeria, what could happen, and also what yourself and the other comrades in the Democratic Socialist Movement are attempting to do in the terms of the movement, which are attempting to build an idea of what can be done, not just simply to complain and to protest, but what is the way out? Because Nigeria is a very rich country in terms of resources, both material and human. The question is that capitalism is not allowing those to be deployed in the interests of the majority of the population. So on that note, I'd like to bring this podcast to an end, but just to say that for those who would like to follow more the developments in Nigeria and the activity of the Democratic Socialist Movement, the comrades, you should look at the DSM's website, socialistnigeria.org, which gives an outline of what is happening in Nigeria and also how the comrades and activists of the DSM analyze the situation and are also being active. So on that note, I'd like to bring this podcast to a close and thank Soweto again for his participation and his explanation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
The Committee for Workers International is organized on every continent. If you would like to join us and get active building the CWI in your part of the world, please visit our website at socialistworld.net. Here you can also subscribe to our weekly email newsletter and support our work by making a donation. If you have any questions or comments about that podcast, please let us know and we may try and respond in future episodes.